Hello everyone, welcome to the first of our Career Services vlogs. This is, like I said, the first time we've tried this, so I hope the sound is coming through all right. I'm Naomi Usman-Watts, Assistant Director for Career Management at Newcastle University Careers Service, and I'm joined today by Chris Trainer, Guidance Team Manager for Newcastle University Careers Service as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the career planning side of things, because we know it's really important at this time. People are thinking about career planning in these really uncertain times and dealing with some anxiety around the changing graduate labour market and how you sort of manage that from your perspective. So welcome to Chris. Thanks for joining us. Chris, tell us a little bit more about this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. I know it was nice to talk, even if it is in this kind of strange remote working from home environment, but nice to catch up. You're absolutely right. I think it is an uncertain time. We live in an uncertain world, and how students deal with that and how we all deal with that, particularly when our career plans, is a kind of acute thought for many people. I mean, the current health crisis, the kind of pandemic crisis that we're experiencing at the moment, has impacted all aspects of our lives, not least economically. And when we see that, often it's been the same in the previous economic downturns, that invariably then does trickle through at some point to have an impact on the graduate labour market. And I guess we're beginning to see some evidence of that at the moment. We're not sure exactly to what extent or how long that will last for, but there are some suggestions that some employers are reviewing their kind of hiring plans, not all, but some, and those that are continuing perhaps are changing their selection processes. So that may be doing more virtual internship, more virtual interviews or assessment centres. So there's a lot of change out there, and of course change breeds questions and uncertainty. So it's very much the case, and I sort of categorise that. I think the ways we operate in what I'd call a VUCA world. So that's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And although that's probably particularly prevalent in the current periods, to be honest, it's probably been becoming increasingly evident for several years now in the workplace. And as things have become more complex, as the working lives have changed, and that kind of notion of a job for life has almost vanished for most people. There are several different factors now which makes our career paths more uncertain and more unpredictable. And so while I think this current situation, this current crisis, I'm sure will pass and things will improve, the idea of dealing with uncertainty is something that will probably remain for all of us to some extent in our future working lives. So for me, this is it's an opportunity, isn't it? You've got a really kind of acute periods of uncertainty, and for all of us, it's a case of, can we use this to maybe sharpen our career management skills in a way which allows us to cope with that uncertainty now, but also if we can do that, it'll help us hopefully for the rest of our careers as things progress.
So how do you think students could best cope with this? How should they aim to deal with this sort of complex situation and context that we're in at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no single correct way, is the honest answer. So some people, for example, are naturally planners and are quite analytical in the way they make decisions about things and their careers, and they have I'm probably an example of this myself, quite process-orientated person. Where am I today? Where I want to be later on? What's the path to get there? And there's advantages to that. You're quite considered, and your decision making, you maybe have quite a goal-orientated nature. That's kind of plus sign. But I suppose, given the current landscape and all the VUCA characteristics just described, it's probably advisable to be a bit more agile in how you approach things. So and that sort of feels naturally true, I guess, because if you look at a lot of people, successful people, mid-career, senior career, and you ask them, how did you get to where you are today? It's quite often they'll say things like, well, I don't know, it just happened, or I never planned to be in this position I would never imagine when I was graduating that I would have been doing this role. It was a bit of luck that I got into this break, or a lucky break, or something like that. And so that you hear that a lot from people. It's obviously quite effective for people, that less kind of structured planning approach. And it's probably borne out in the data as well. So we have a lot of research these days which suggests that people will have 4, 5, 6, 7 major career changes across their working lives. And there's some evidence which says that the first kind of graduate job itself typically only lasts maybe 2 years for people. So there's a lot of change and unpredictability in how our careers will develop. And so having a really kind of structured roadmap, if you like, can be unrealistic. And I see this a lot of times with students who may be approaching graduation and feel that pressure to make that absolutely accurate, 100% accurate decision about what they want to do as their first graduate job, because it feels like such a big decision and you're locked into that. Mm-hmm. And whilst it's true to an extent, it's a big decision, I think the evidence and the data would suggest that you're not going to be doing that first role forever. And it's more important to be, again, coping with that change and that agility. That's what we'll, hopefully see you well in the long run. And there's a really interesting model where it can explain this as a model called planned happenstance. The planned happenstance model of career decision making. So a guy called John Crumbott's a professor from Stanford University, and to me this encapsulates the right approach really quite nicely. Rather than having a step-by-step process on how to develop your career or make decisions about your career, what the planned happenstance model says is that you can almost make your own luck. Planned happenstance is an oxymoron. It's planned chance, and you can almost put yourself in a position where good things will happen, and you can, if you're flexible enough and open-minded enough, that can open doors. And he basically talks about 5 key mindsets or behaviours that are important to kind of adopt, and it's about being curious. So first and foremost, have you, if you're on a job website, for example, and there's a vacancy there which you have no idea what it means, account executive, for example, analyst, or insurance underwriter, something like that. You've got 2 options when you see that on that job website. You either say, I don't know what it means, and I'll skip over it and ignore it, or you're curious enough to click on it, read about it, give it a chance, and that might be something quite interesting that you hadn't previously considered. So curiosity is key. I guess the other thing he talks about is flexibility. So being prepared to give yourself permission, if you like, to look at things out with what you previously had considered, to look at new choices, being open-minded, I guess. Risk-taking talks about. So again, going back to what we talked about in terms of that first role is not likely to be your forever job. It's okay to take a risk sometimes. I think sometimes the pursuit of perfection can be inhibiting to any decision. You become paralyzed and analysis paralysis. Take a risk on something, give it a try, and you never quite know if it doesn't work, you can always change. So that's part of it. Persistence is important. Again, in uncertain periods, whether it's because the labour market's changing or other things, there might be setbacks. It might be you don't get the job that you hope for, or it might be that the employer that you really wanted to kind of work for straight after university stops hiring for a period of time. So you have to be able to kind of cope with that and maintain a sense of optimism. And that's the last thing. It's kind of persistence and optimism, which will keep you going. So those 5 behaviours for me, it's curiosity, flexibility, risk-taking, persistence, optimism, open-mindedness. That planned happenstance model, that kind of encapsulates, I think, many of what we talk about when it's about dealing with uncertainty, being more agile in your approach.
And that reflects a lot of what employers say to us they're looking for in graduates as well, in terms of how they adapt to the workplace. That's all great as a model. Can you provide a bit of a sort of reflection on how you might use that approach effectively? So how would you sort of apply that?
Yeah, I guess it could be that you're, for students, for example, who are in their final year and approaching graduation, I guess it's the type of thing that I would just explain in there. So, it may be that you are having to reassess which employers are recruiting at this time, or it may be reassess actually the sort of sector or industry that you want to go to. For others, actually, they weren't that far along the process in the first place, and so actually they're still thinking, well, I hadn't even considered where to start. And so logging onto the internet and looking at a job vacancy site where there are so many unclear or varying vacancies out there can be a bit overwhelming. And it's about just trying to give yourself a chance to look at something that you might not completely understand what's involved, read around, look at it from a different perspective. And I think, send some applications off and see how where it takes you. For undergraduate students, perhaps who are looking at work experience opportunities, again, if that sort of formal internship that you were hoping for this summer is proving difficult to come by, think about it in a more open-minded, kind of agile way. What else can you do? If it's not the formal kind of internship program, perhaps there are ways to get involved in volunteering. Perhaps there's something you can do online, which is about, there's lots of opportunities right now. You can see them kind of popping up about getting, learning a new skill, or completing a MOOC, or using your language skills to do some sort of translating on a website, which helps in some way in a voluntary way. There are various ways you can still upscale and be productive, and perhaps in doing so gain new insights to new career paths you hadn't previously considered. So I think that's the nature of it. It's just giving yourself the chance to look at alternatives, and not to worry necessarily too much about whether they're the forever option, but you just need to start somewhere.
And if a student's a little bit lost and they're thinking that they need to talk to someone about how to apply these models, what they need to do next, what would you advise?
Yeah, I mean, I think by all means get in touch with us. We're in the Career Service, we continue to kind of support students on a one-to-one basis. So, if any of this is resonating or making people think, please get in touch with us via the website. On the Career Service website, there's a button which talks about My Career, and My Career is the platform where people can get in touch individually for one-to-one support, and we can follow up and take it through with them in more detail. There's also quite a lot online about this planned happenstance model I mentioned, so people could look into that if they're keen to get a bit more detail. And finally, I think just a bit of reassurance in that the UK actual labour market is structurally built in a way which supports this sort of agile approach. It's often described as a sort of non-linear graduate labour market. And what they mean by that is, if you're studying a certain subject, employers are quite receptive to you perhaps changing direction and going into a different field. That's not always the case in every labour market internationally, but in the UK we certainly have that. And so I guess an example could be that if you're you're a final year student and you're thinking about, maybe you come across a job which is a brand management job. Somebody studying history and music is every bit as entitled, for most employers anyway, to apply for that job as somebody studying marketing or business management. Okay, so whether you're studying something totally different or something similar, there's an understanding out there from employers that you're going to be agile enough and flexible enough to pick up the skills on the job. And so that gives hopefully people the permission to kind of just look around and see what else is out there other than the vocational ones that they perhaps might have considered so far. So yeah, there's choice out there. Obviously choice can be a bit overwhelming at times, so yeah, get in touch with somebody in the Career Service and we can have that kind of individual conversation to kind of talk through in a bit more detail. But just remember the support out there.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, that's brilliant. Thank you all for listening. We hope this has been helpful. Because it's our first time, we'd love to know what you've thought and whether you found it helpful. Do share it with friends, but also get in touch with us via our social media platforms, via the My Career app on the Career Service website. And we're also keen to know which other topics you'd want to hear about. So are there things that are worrying you, concerning you, that you'd like us to cover? And we'll go ahead and do that in these vlogs. Thanks again, Chris. Any final reflections for our students before we head off?
No, that's great. Thank you, Naomi. Enjoyed it, and hope to see you all soon when we get back to normality.
Yeah, thank you very much. See you. Bye.
Goodbye.